that debt, to be honest.
Well, I think you've added a lot of value, though, yourself.
Thank you.
All right, I've noticed that it's just after 6 o'clock, and we do want to try to keep to time tonight because some people have events on at 7 o'clock. So I'd like to start by just welcoming everyone tonight, and this is our 6th Brennan Justice Talk series, and tonight we'll be focusing on LGBTQI justice issues. My name is Jane Wangmann, and I am one of the co-directors of the Brennan Justice and Leadership Program here in the Faculty of Law at UTS. I'm joined tonight by a few key members of our Brennan team. I have Mark Samuel, who is standing in for my fellow co-director from the Law Student Society, Erika Serrano, Professor Leslie Hitchens, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Maxine Evers, our Associate Dean, Education, Eleanor Tong, our Law Alumni Team member, Krista McLaughlin, our Brennan Administrator, Paul Redman, our former co-director, and most importantly, our special alumni guest and presenter this evening, Nicholas Stewart. Tonight, we have the unique pleasure of not only having our UTS Law students here tonight, but also our UTS Law alumni, all who are passionate about social justice issues. Before we start the proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are sitting and participating in this Zoom session. I am coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I acknowledge that some of you might be coming from other traditional lands, and I acknowledge those traditional elders as well. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are in the room participating in this session tonight. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just have a couple of housekeeping items to just make sure that we're on top of everything for the event. First up, this Zoom session is being recorded for teaching and learning and event purposes. Only the key speakers and those people that ask questions will be recorded in any recording of this session. As you are probably aware by now, having been in many Zoom events over the last half of the year, each of you have the ability to hide your camera, show your camera, as well as mute and unmute your microphone. We do ask that you mute your microphone when you are not speaking to prevent any background noise distracting the speakers. And if your bandwidth allows and you feel comfortable doing so, it would be great if you could have your camera on, particularly when you're asking a question. This does make it feel like a more interactive event, and it's great to see friendly faces. If you do have your camera on and you're finding that it's freezing, just hide your camera and it might free up some bandwidth for you. Lastly, for those of you who are Brennan students, could you please enter your full name as it appears in the UTS system in the chat box so that we can record your participation for ROJ points. And to all members of the audience tonight, you can also use the chat box to ask questions, and we will also have ample time at the end of this session for you to ask questions directly of our speaker. So now, after all that housekeeping is settled, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker tonight, Nicholas Stewart. Nicholas is one of our UTS alumni graduating with his law degree in 2009. He is a partner at the Out Loud and Proud Dowson Turco Lawyers, which is a boutique and prominent LGBTI law firm based in Newtown here in Sydney. Prior to this position, he worked at Ellison and Singtel Optus. He has appeared before the Australian Crime Commission, the Children's Court of New South Wales, the District Court of New South Wales, and the Federal Court of Australia. Nicholas has also appeared in prominent constitutional and human rights cases before the High Court of Australia. Nicholas is known for his successful prosecution of a large discrimination case brought by 4 gay police officers who suffered homosexual discrimination while employees at the New South Wales Police Force. He is also the lawyer for Alan Rosendale, a gay bashing victim of the 1980s, who believes his assaulters were part of an organised group of law enforcement members who engaged in systematic gay bashings during that time. Nicholas has a long-standing and strong commitment to social justice issues. In 2009, he was awarded the Elizabeth Hastings Memorial Human Rights Award and the UTS Law Alumni Association Prize after many years of working on social justice in East Sydney. In 2018, Nicholas also received the UTS Community Alumni Award. Nicholas is a Public Interest Litigation Chair and Executive at Australian Lawyers for Human Rights and a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at the Law Society of New South Wales. Nicholas is also, in his spare time, Vice President of the New Theatre in Newtown, Australia's second oldest community theatre. Nicholas was a leading advocate for the New South Wales Legislative Council's inquiry into gay and transgender hate crimes that took place between 1970 and 2010 in New South Wales. This inquiry commenced in October 2019. It has been receiving submissions all this year and hearings will start to take place in November. Tonight, Nicholas is going to cover a wide range of justice issues that face the LGBTI community here in Australia. And it's a great pleasure to have Nicholas here as our Justice Talks keynote tonight and to have such a large and interested audience here to hear him speak. So over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm going to share my screen now and just bring up some slides which I will talk to. But I imagine that there's going to be a lot that you'll want to know after, and you might want to ask questions, and that's probably the best time for me to go into issues that I haven't covered. There are quite a few slides here, and in that respect, I might move fast. So if there are questions you want to ask or issues that you have in anything I've talked about, just make a note, and then that way you can raise that later in the session. You should all now see my slides. I'm going to start the slideshow. So as Jane mentioned, I am a partner at an out loud LGBT law firm, Dowson Turco. I joined the firm 10 years ago as a partner after years working as a corporate lawyer. And I think I was drawn to the firm because I had this inner passion for the LGBT community. And I really wanted to work with humans and problem solve. I love my work at Ellison, and I often wonder what my life would have been like if I'd stayed there. But this was my calling, and I've really, I've always put into life what I want out of life. And in that respect, this firm has really been the vehicle for that. It's allowed me to take charge of my career and take on matters that are really interesting to me, but also to help the community. I'm on LinkedIn, and my firm often advertises paralegal positions and lawyer positions on LinkedIn. And so I would encourage you all to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I like to share stuff on LinkedIn. I think it's a great platform for lawyers and people in the community to share interesting articles and also learn about each other. You would often, you'll build a network, and you'll often be surprised as to where your friends and colleagues from university are going. And I think LinkedIn is a great platform for that, because it isn't Twitter. It isn't a place where people attack each other. It's generally a professional space where you can share interesting ideas and connect with people who may be useful to you in the future. So please don't hesitate to connect with me. My firm is known for all kinds of reasons, and Jane mentioned some of them, including that New South Wales police case. I'm not going to speak much about the police case in my slides, but I'll be happy to in the questions at the end, because that case was an enormous case. And having come from corporate law, where I've acted in large-scale litigation in the federal court involving billions of dollars of claims, I have to say that that litigation for those 4 gay police officers was the biggest I've ever been in. It took a huge toll on them as litigants, and it took a huge toll on me as a lawyer for them. And I'm happy to say that we won that case, and we won it quite well, but it really took it out of me, and I'm not sure I'll do it again. A few years back, the firm also took on a friends with benefits case involving a same-sex couple who, I shouldn't say couple, a same-sex partnership that was primarily sexual. There was no sharing of a life together. There was no romance, so to speak. And when the parties broke up, the poorer party sought to make a claim that the parties were in fact in a de facto relationship and brought property proceedings. And we ran an argument that they were effectively in a friends with benefits arrangement. There wasn't a marriage, there wasn't a de facto relationship. And we won that case, and that was one of the first cases of that kind in the Federal Circuit Court. And at its time was a landmark, but there's been plenty since then. Sorry, let's go back. I also represented Jesse Willisey, who's the son of Terry Willisey, a former Current Affairs host in the USA. Jesse is an advocate for decriminalisation of marijuana and, in his words, blazed a joint on the steps of Town Hall while inviting the media to come and watch him smoke marijuana in a protest against the criminalisation of drugs. He was arrested and charged with administering a prohibited substance, and I represented him in the local court in what was quite a significant set of proceedings because it was the public use of drugs in a protest when there were other means of protest and other ways to advocate for change without committing a crime. And I found myself arguing this to effectively help him escape conviction in circumstances where he had committed a crime and he'd done so in public. I've also represented, and Jane mentioned that I'd been in the Crime Commission. I was in the Crime Commission, which is a very unique jurisdiction to be in. My client had been summoned to appear before the Crime Commission and was not permitted to disclose why he was going there to anyone, including his wife, his employer, and couldn't really explain his long absences for work because he would be committing a crime to do so. And I'm happy to answer questions about that later on. Tonight, I'm going to cover 4 issues if I can in the timeframe we've got. I'm going to talk about balancing religious freedom with LGBTIQ rights. I'm going to talk about Australia's history of LGBT hate crimes. I'm going to talk about Mark Latham's Education Legislation Amendment Parental Rights Bill. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about how you can get involved and how you can be a change maker. When I talk about LGBT discrimination and religious freedom, I often make a point of saying that I personally and many of my friends in the LGBT community space are not against people having the right to express their religion or practice their religion. But the principle that we talk about at Australian Lawyers for Human Rights and from an international law perspective is that human rights are not in a hierarchy. Religious freedom is not superior to LGBT rights to be free from harassment. All human rights are equal, and where they conflict, we need a mechanism and a structure for resolving those conflicts. And that's why a Human Rights Act is so important, and New South Wales doesn't have one. In New South Wales, and because I am a graduate of the university and it's in New South Wales University, I'm going to talk about probably the worst anti-discrimination law that exists in Australia, and that is the New South Wales Act. I might mention that it is before a parliamentary committee at the moment. It's up for review, and that review is desperately needed. I've got there an image of George Michael painted as a saint, and some of you may know that that mural existed in Newtown for quite some time and was defaced by people I referred to in a column I wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald a few years ago, who were Christian warriors who were seeking to deface that mural on the basis that it offended their religion. Section 56 of the Anti-Discrimination Act in New South Wales says that nothing in the Act affects any other practice when it comes to propagating religion, doctrines of that religion, and any susceptibilities of the adherents of that religion. It's effectively a carte blanche permission for people within or religious organisations to discriminate, to exclude people that they disagree with. For example, the Wesley Mission under this provision is permitted to deny services to, say, gay men seeking to foster if they want to, if that is offensive or offends adherents of that religion. Now, what's probably most concerning in the Anti-Discrimination Act is that there is no protection for people in relation to religious discrimination. Someone who experiences religious discrimination does not have any rights under the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act. And so I'm a proponent for legislative change, for drafting within the Act to facilitate a mechanism for someone who is discriminated against on religious grounds to be able to take an action. But I object to this kind of carte blanche exemption of religious organisations from enacting their own discrimination against, say, LGBT people in circumstances where there is no hierarchy of rights and religious freedom is not a superior right. But I do want the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act to have a provision for religious protection. And I might just give you an example of how that plays out. My firm is currently acting for a Saudi gay man who is suing an educational provider in circumstances where in a class, I'm trying not to identify him, in a class, the teacher of his class made comments which were offensive to his religion. And he made a complaint to the Anti-Discrimination Board without us, without legal representation. And the complaint was declined by the President because, in the President's words, the respondent organisation had taken steps, made efforts to remedy the issue. He then came to my firm and wanted to prosecute a discrimination claim. Now he can't, in New South Wales, he can't prosecute a religious discrimination complaint. It has to be race, or it has to be homosexual or transgendered. It can't be religious. And that's an example. And the matter's about to settle, and quite favourably to him, because we ran a quasi-race, ethno-religious argument. And I think the respondent probably saw that we were going after them. But what I want to say there is it's peculiar because we never, he was a gay man and that wasn't the issue. He was Saudi, but that wasn't the issue. He was Muslim, he is Muslim, and that is the issue, and yet he has no protection under New South Wales law. So that's just an example of how that plays out. Now, this mural here was defaced, and it was a very sad day for the LGBT community because that mural represented freedom and liberation and all the good things about being a member of our community. And the people who defaced it were charged with property offences and tried to run religious freedom arguments in the court where they failed. And then, anyway, I won't comment more, but if you want to read my article, you can Google it and see what I have to say about it. When it comes to homosexual vilification, that is inciting hatred towards homosexuals, the New South Wales Act contains this provision, which says it's effectively unlawful to, by a public act, incite hatred. But there are exemptions, and they are many. Nothing in this section renders unlawful a fair report of a public act. So the news can report on a vilifying act and not be then the subject of a claim. There's also the issue of absolute privilege, which defamation students would know all about. And there's also this issue of an act done reasonably and in good faith for academic, artistic, religious, instructional, research purposes, or for other purposes in the public interest, whatever that means, including discussion and expositions of any act or matter. Now, all of the constitutional students would know that Australia doesn't have free speech. We have an implied right to freedom of political communication. And yet people who want to vilify the community, that the homosexual or LGBT community, say that they have the right to say whatever they want. But I would argue that words can be extremely hurtful and damaging, and there have been many, many cases in the public arena where the LGBT community has been vilified. During the postal survey episode that we went through with gay marriage, you would have seen a lot of statements in some areas of the press which I would argue are vilifying, but which would probably have one of these exceptions, including public interest or discussion or exposition of an actual matter. So vilification laws are just not up to where we are up to in society at the moment. This act was drafted at a time when Twitter and Facebook and social media as a whole didn't exist. And it really gives rise to all kinds of issues. I would argue that the law in New South Wales has to balance religious freedoms with LGBT rights, that LGBT people need more protection, but people with religious convictions also need protection. We need a Human Rights Act, and we need probably a jurisdiction to hear disputes about conflicting rights. In Canada, there are examples of judicial commissions or courts that can hear arguments between plaintiffs and respondents in respect of conflicting rights. And I would argue that if you've got practitioners in that space who are familiar with human rights and how they're applied, you can resolve conflicts. But at the moment, I don't think our legal system, in New South Wales anyway, can deal with them sufficiently. I'm happy to ask to entertain any further questions about that at the end. I might just say that my firm acted for Gary Burns, who's a prominent LGBT activist, and he had made a vilification complaint against a person who had run for political office down in Victoria. And that person had said in her campaigning as a member of the Christian Democratic Party that all gay men are pedophiles, or words to that effect. And Gary took her on and brought proceedings in the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal for vilification. And the matter went all the way to the New South Wales Court of Appeal after various appeals. And the question ultimately for the Court of Appeal was whether the tribunal, the Civil and Administrative Tribunal, had jurisdiction to hear a dispute between residents of different states. In a world where communication such as vilification happens online, as if it is happening next door, you know, what that political candidate said down in Victoria, she may as well have said it on the front steps of Parliament in New South Wales. And it's an example of a tribunal that was set up to deal with discrimination disputes being incapable of dealing with a dispute like that because it infringed the Constitution for it to do so. It's not a Chapter 3 court. We acted in the High Court for Gary. We knew, I think we knew what the answer was, but it had to go to the High Court as a public interest case for the High Court to determine that. In that case, you can see that online, but my firm worked with Alan's Linklaters and Landon Rogers in that case for Gary, and obviously we lost. We were trying to argue that for the intents and purposes of the Discrimination Act, that NCAT was a jurisdiction for that dispute. But now Gary has effectively had to run all of his proceedings again in New South Wales in a Chapter 3 court to bring that prosecution. The next thing I want to talk about is LGBT hate crimes. And this is quite a passionate issue for me, and it probably is. Some of you may have clicked on that link when I was on the drum a few years ago talking about this inquiry, but my passion for this issue comes from me working as a teenager at KFC in Artarmon. One Saturday night when a relief manager was appointed from the King's Cross store, and anyone who knows King's Cross in the 90s knew it as quite a colourful place where gay men and lesbians and transgender people and drag queens went out at night. And when this manager came into my store, he was wearing the pink shirt, which was ordinarily worn by female managers. You know, the male managers wore blue and the female managers wore pink, but he wore pink. And I remember him being quite a nice guy. He was really kind, he was supportive, he wanted to get the shift done. And then all of a sudden, one of my colleagues in the store came up to me and whispered to me and said that he and his friends would go out looking for people like that manager on the northern beaches with a view to robbing them, bashing them, and chucking them off cliffs. And as a 14-year-old, I wasn't even out. I hadn't even worked out my own sexuality. I think I knew that I was gay, but I hadn't said it to myself. And yet I had this person telling me that he was effectively brutalizing my community. He was hunting people down because of their sexuality. And I didn't have the confidence to stand up to him then, but I tell you what, I'm going after everyone like him, and I'm going to hold them to account, because there is an awful history of gay murders and bashings in this state. South Australia has it too, Victoria has it as well. And as a society, we cannot move on until the people who committed these awful crimes are held to account. So I've pasted some images of some of the deceased here, and I realise that might be triggering for a lot of you, but I want to really raise this issue because it's undetermined, and it needs to be in the mainstream. Our society can't move on until we've dealt with this issue. You'll see the top left-hand corner is Ross Warren. Ross was a newsreader from Wollongong. He parked his car just near Marks Park in Bondi, and he was never seen again. No one knows what happened to him, although there was a coronial inquest. And that inquest only came because Ross's mother was writing to the New South Wales Commissioner of Police saying, "My son is missing. Can you please help me find my son? I think something's gone wrong. If this isn't like him, I need your help." And her first letter was ignored. And then, a few weeks later, she wrote again and she said, "Commissioner, please, I really need some help. I think something's gone astray here." And she was ignored. And then she wrote a third time and she said, "It's been a year. My son's missing. There's been no investigation. I want an inquest." And she was ignored. And it was only because of a beautiful police officer working in the eastern suburbs who came across Ross's file and found all of his mother's letters and thought, something is going on here. And this is not a gay cop. This is a straight cop. Beautiful, beautiful man. And he looked into the matter and he organised surveillance and you name it. He thought he'd identified some gangs of youths that were hunting gay men. Anyway, he referred the matter to the New South Wales Coroner's Court, and Jacqueline Millage, who was a coroner at the time, conducted an inquiry, and she determined that Ross Warren was murdered. And his body's never been found. Gillies Martinet is the guy in the black and white next to Ross. He's, no one's been found for his killing either, and he also disappeared in Bondi. John Russell below, John was found at the bottom of a cliff, deceased, and he had in his hands hair, presumably the hair of his attackers, and that exhibit went missing. Critical evidence that may have led to the prosecution of the person that killed him is missing. So that's why I'm campaigning for this. I'm campaigning for a judicial commission of inquiry. We've got a parliamentary inquiry going right now. It's been fantastic to put on the record this awful history and allow victims, because there are survivors, and you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner my client Alan Rosendale with Paul Symes, the redhead on the left. There are survivors who want to tell their stories, and a parliamentary inquiry has been a great vehicle for that, because it's put onto Hansard on the parliamentary record the stories of victims of hate crimes. Alan, who you see there in the right-hand corner, was bashed in 1989 on South Dowling Street. He was at a gay beat. He admits that he was there for sex, but that doesn't give the right to anyone to abuse him or assault him. Anyway, he was, a car pulled up, and out of that car jumped 4 or 5 men who then popped the boot and grabbed what Alan originally thought were planks of wood, but which, well, we're not sure what they were, but they chased all of the gay men out of that beat, and Alan tripped and fell, and then he was bashed in the gutter and bashed unconscious. The guy on the left in the red hair is Paul Symes, and he didn't know Alan at the time, but he was walking across the street. He'd gone to get some milk, and he saw Alan being bashed, and he reported it to the New South Wales Police Force, who confirmed that the vehicle registration that he saw was a New South Wales Police vehicle. Alan put that matter to the back of his head. He was taken to hospital. The hospital notes that we've obtained said that he was bashed by skinheads, but he never said that he was bashed by skinheads. So the person investigating Alan's death had kind of created a bit of a narrative. Rick Fennelly, who's a beautiful journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald, wrote about Alan's bashing, but at that time didn't know that it was Alan who was bashed. He was only relying on Paul Symes' account. And Alan read about Paul Symes' account of his bashing and thought, hang on, that's me. And then contacted Rick Fennelly, and they've retraced their steps. Paul Symes says that he went to a meeting of the top brass of the New South Wales Police Force, who accepted that there was a police vehicle involved in the bashing, but the New South Wales Police Force says that that was another bashing, that wasn't Alan's bashing, and we don't have anything. So that's still going, and I look forward to finding out what happened to Alan all that time ago, but it's people like Alan that we need to come forward to talk about that. The purpose of the parliamentary inquiry was to raise awareness of Sydney's dark history, put evidence of hate crimes on Hansard and the parliamentary record, but also to allow victims to be heard. We also wanted to develop government policy around LGBT safety and justice. We wanted the government to really take this on as an issue because LGBT people still aren't safe. We wanted to identify issues for further investigation, and we wanted to build a pathway to a judicial commission. A lot of people say to me, oh, why didn't you go for a royal commission? Why weren't you campaigning for a judicial commission of inquiry? And quite frankly, I just didn't think it would get up. I thought that a parliamentary inquiry was probably the first soft step to put these matters on the record, with my end game knowing, I would eventually go for this judicial commission of inquiry. And that's what I'm going for now. And my firm's working with ACON, New South Wales, to get that on board. And I think it'll eventually happen, but the parliamentary inquiry was a really important first step. And those of you who don't know, there is a big difference between a parliamentary inquiry and a judicial commission. I've set out those differences here. Judicial commissions really have investigative powers. They can summons witnesses and interrogate evidence. They can compel production of documents from private citizens and government departments and corporations, and they can question the investigative methods and strategies, and they can then provide a report. I would like the officers who originally were contacted about Ross Warren's disappearance to explain why his mother's letters were ignored. I want John Russell's investigators to explain how the only exhibit that would probably lead us to his murderer went missing. I want people who wrote off gay deaths as suicides to explain why they held the prejudices they did and why leads weren't followed. Why weren't witnesses spoken to? Why was evidence lost? I think we need to get to the bottom of that. And for those people, I don't want them to be disciplined. I don't want them to be punished. But I think we need answers. We need to identify, call it out, that there were at the time parts of government that were not responsive to our community, and we were ignored. And in that respect, I think, the AIDS crisis, some of you won't know, but in the 80s, there was a campaign, a health campaign to slow down the AIDS virus, which was killing gay men. HIV was a massive thing, and there are some parallels with the COVID pandemic, believe it or not. But the health campaign depicted the Grim Reaper throwing bowling balls down a bowling ball alley, wiping out children and families. It was a very effective campaign. It helped slow the AIDS crisis. It helped bring awareness to gay men about the dangers of unprotected sex. It was a very effective health campaign, but the other collateral consequence was that gay men were alienated. We were put onto the fringe. We were pitched as perverts, as a sexual minority, unworthy of equal rights. And I put this, this gay bashing issue down to a lot of that and a lot of the prejudice that flowed from that. Jane, how are we going for timing?
It's 6:37. So if we want to try to leave enough time for questions, maybe to 45 and then have 15 minutes of questions, if that's possible.
Yep. Sure, okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to skip Mark Latham's education bill, other than to tell you that at the moment, Mark Latham is a New South Wales Member of Parliament. He's the former federal opposition leader for the Labor Party. He's now a member of One Nation, and he has put forward an amendment bill to the Education Act in New South Wales to amend that act and effectively remove any kind of education that might help gay and trans kids understand who they are. So, for example, he wants to prohibit schools from teaching that trans and gender people exist and should be treated with respect. This is a law that is before the New South Wales Parliament right now, and it attempts to do this. He wants to prohibit school counsellors from affirming a trans or gender diverse student or providing them with any support. He wants to put teachers at risk of losing their job when they support trans or gender diverse students. He wants to enshrine biological fallacies and describe intersex people as disordered. He wants to allow parents to deny their children access to lessons. He wants to require schools to present discredited counter-narratives. For example, when discussing evolution, he says that teachers should be able to talk about creationism. And he says, when talking about science and biology, that teachers should be able to talk about anti-vaccination theories. And he says that when talking about Indigenous incarceration, teachers should be able to talk about their own ideologies about overrepresentation. I just want to put that out there because that's a really concerning piece of legislation. When you're in law school, you think that the law is law and it's there to regulate society. And as lawyers, we are there to navigate the law and advise clients about the law. Well, let me tell you something, the law doesn't have to always be the law, and you are all in a position to change the law. And when pieces of legislation like this come out, I would say that it's every lawyer's obligation to write to their local member, write to the Premier and express dissatisfaction with any government support. I'm not saying the government supports this bill, but it is the subject of a committee and an inquiry, and it has gotten the attention of various MPs, and I would say it's an attack. It's an attack on the LGBT community, and it's pretty disgusting. Anyway, the final thing I want to say before we go into questions is that you can all affect change and you can all get involved, and I want to show you how. As Jane mentioned, I sit on the executive of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. I'm the Public Interest Litigation Chair, and I'm also the LGBT Subcommittee Chair. At ALHR, we have thematic committees, and I'm not saying you all have to come and join the LGBT committee, but you're welcome. We have a Women and Girls Committee, we have a Children's Rights Committee, we have a First Nations Committee, Refugee Rights Committee, a Freedoms Committee, and a Human Rights Act Committee. And all of those committees are very busy. They are all writing submissions on draft bills in federal parliament, appearing at inquiries and giving evidence, engaging in advocacy, meeting with members of parliament. They're all doing good things, and we rely so much on very keen law students. So think about joining Australian Lawyers for Human Rights because you can affect change. That's my presentation, and I'm keen to answer your questions.
Well, thank you, Nick, for a really insightful, informative, and invaluable presentation. I think I can definitely say that I learned a lot and got out a lot from it. Just as we go into questioning, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box or take yourself off mute or go on video. I'm sure we'll appreciate that. And I guess I'll kick off questions. So I was looking into the education legislation amendment bill, and they brought into the discussion a legal definition of gender fluidity. So I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on a legal definition of that.
I think that's a question for a doctor rather than a lawyer, to be honest. The issue for gender fluidity is really up to the individual and how they feel and how they identify. There are various states and territories that have dealt with this issue. Tasmania is probably the best in terms of who can change their birth certificate and in what circumstances without the compulsory surgery that some states mandate. So yeah, I probably won't get into what gender fluidity means other than to say it's really up to the individual.
Thanks, Nick. Does anyone else have questions? Maximilian, I think.
Thank you for that presentation. Just in terms of the section you went over in terms of homosexual vilification and transgender vilification, was there any particular state you saw good laws from that we could potentially adapt or borrow to New South Wales?
Thanks, Max. Look, I think Tasmania, again, surprisingly, because it was the last state to decriminalise homosexuality, but it seems to be the first state to do anything to protect us, I think has a really good anti-discrimination act. But you know what I think what we really need is a Human Rights Act. Every state and territory and at a Commonwealth level, we need a Human Rights Act, because the issues of rights and discrimination and the right to be free from discrimination is a human right. Generally, I find that they're always conflicting, and we need a regime to deal with those and a forum for them to be prosecuted that looks at matters as if they are rights.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. I think Lucia had a question.
Yeah, hi. Sorry if this question isn't super clear or articulate. I'm very tired. So obviously you spoke about gay bashing and violence against queer people, but I've been reading a lot about how prison and police abolition are like quite intrinsically linked, because of how it's about thinking outside like what we find to be normal. And I know there's a lot of like grassroots movements in terms of queer liberation and police and prison abolition. But is there any like movement or kind of work towards that in, I guess, like traditional legal capacity?
No, thanks, Lucia. I'm not sure. I don't think so. And I'm not sure I subscribe either. It's complex, but yeah, I'm not sure. In a formal legal space, I just don't know.
Thanks, Nick. And we might go to, sorry if I pronounce this wrong, Yamania.
Oh, it's Emmanuel Brown. Thanks, Mark. And Nicola, thank you so much. My name is Twisina Emmanuel Brown. Did a Master's of Intellectual Property Law at UTS. We have very similar roads. I went through corporate and now I'm a full-time human rights activist. I'm the Co-Secretary General of ILGA World, which is based in Geneva, the largest organizational representative members from around the world. And what you are describing in your presentation is the reality on the ground for many human rights activists. But I'm wondering if you have given some thought as part of your collective group to Australia's UPR processes, or the Universal Periodical Review processes, as an added avenue to bring these issues up for discussion, because the lofty ideals of the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights are very aspirational, but the reality, as you know, as we've just heard from your presentation, on the ground is completely different. And that these laws like Mark Latham's proposed bill, they are nothing more than state-sponsored homophobia, lesbophobia, and transphobia, and we need to do everything we can to combat that. So that was just a thing about the UPR process, because that's when Australia will turn up to the United Nations and the world will then question them on their record on human rights.
Yeah, thanks, Imania. You raise a really good point. And as you were talking, the first thing I want to say is I've talked about LGBT rights, and let's not forget that First Nations people are the original victims of discrimination, alienation, harassment, violence, murder in this country. And I speak as a white gay man who's probably in quite a privileged position, and I can affect change. And I talk about LGBT hate crimes and murders, but I tell you what, we all know the First Nations people of this country have suffered enduring centuries of violence and murder, and many of the perpetrators have never been held to account. So I just want to say that. The second thing I want to say is I completely agree with you that Australia is a signatory to many international treaties. Our governments have an obligation to make laws that are consistent with their international obligations. We also have an obligation to ensure that citizens can raise complaints and have their complaints dealt with by in a forum with a mechanism that is designed with international human rights laws and treaties at play. And we just don't have that right now. There are points of call. You can raise a human rights breach. The Human Rights Law Centre, for example, has recently raised a complaint about in relation to people from Papua New Guinea and what they've suffered as a result of mining practices. You can raise human rights complaints, but what I'm saying is that we need something bigger resourced that is set up to deal with what is an international framework of human rights, which seems to be conveniently lost when particular parties get into power.
Awesome. Thanks, Yamania, and thanks, Nick, for answering that. I think we had Natasha had her hand up, or Lachlan. We might go to Lachlan or Natasha.
Hey, Nick, thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question just, I guess, on a bit more of a personal note. I know a lot of people, including myself, are very passionate about issues that are often because they're closely linked to the community. For example, as a woman of colour, I'm very interested in intersectional approaches to feminism and advocacy for women of colour. And I was just wondering how, I guess, you managed to advocate whilst also maintaining an underlying strength, because I noticed you said that potentially you wouldn't do another case like you did at the beginning of your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Yeah, really good question. You know, I've talked about the hate crimes, my campaign for justice, and justice is a loose word, but I'll use it now, for victims of hate crimes. And I talk about that message over and over, and I talk about those deaths over and over, and it never gets easier. Like, for example, there was a moment 20 minutes ago where I thought I was going to cry as I was talking to you. It was just, you know, I felt myself getting sad. And I was on ABC radio just after the New South Wales government had commissioned the inquiry. And I was with Rick Fennelly, who's that amazing journalist who's raised the profile, and Alan Rosendale. And we were in the studio talking about hate crimes, and Cassie McCulloch, who was the ABC journalist, was talking about her time and working as a young teenager at a hairdressing salon on Oxford Street, and how it was like, for some people, it was an amazing time, the 80s and the 90s. I wish I could have been a gay man in the 80s and 90s, but for all this violence. It was actually quite a cool time. There were clubs pumping, you know, it was a moment of liberation, and freedom, but it also had this very dark side. Anyway, I got out of talking about that, and Cassie put on her favourite track. She said, this song reminds me of that time, and she played it. And the music was so evocative. It struck something in me. And I got into the taxi and I just burst into tears. Like, I was just so zonked. Like, it's just years and years and years of campaigning were all catching up with me, and I was a bloody mess, like absolute mess. But you keep strong, because I think if you have a conscience and you identify what's fair, then that is the core of humanity. You're appealing to the common good, and just remember that you're on the good side of history, that if you push on in years to come, you know, you will have affected change, and that's how I keep strong. You know, that police case, it really did destroy me, but you know what? I mean, it's brought people into my office. People come to me and say, I want you to fight for me. And I say, are you sure? You know, are you sure you want to do that? Because I saw what it did to those clients, and I know it would happen again. But look, I just think it's really important to keep a balance, make sure you're doing other things, exercise, you know, have a project, read, take holidays, that kind of stuff.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Natasha, and thanks, Nick. That was some important takeaways from that question. Before we go on to Lachlan's question, might just remind everyone to, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat, or raise your hand, or just ask it. But yes, Lachlan, take it away with your question.
Cool. Thank you. Hi, Nick, again. Great to see you again. My question is probably a little bit more of like a theoretical sort of question based on your discussion of the Anti-Discrimination Act and your idea about introducing a provision of the Act to incorporate religious discrimination. For students who have undertaken Australian civil liberties law as an elective at UTS, we sort of learn about how the current discrimination framework focuses mostly upon inherent or immutable characteristics of people, and there's sort of a line of argument within the development of discrimination law in Australia and around the world, particularly in the US, that focuses on the idea that discrimination law is there to protect people on the basis of something that they cannot change about themselves. So, for example, race discrimination is there because of the fact that you can't change your race. You know, you can't change your ethnic identity in the same way that on the basis of sexuality, it's not realistically possible to change your sexuality from gay to straight, etc. So how do you sort of explain that, the idea of introducing religious discrimination, and how that potentially conflicts with the existing idea that it focuses on protecting immutable and inherent characteristics of people?
Yeah, well, I would go back to international human rights law, which is really grounded in the freedom of the individual, you know, the freedom to express oneself in the way that they want to. And I wouldn't necessarily agree that religion is changeable. I mean, I agree that people change religions all the time, but if a person has found a belief, and within a religion that they have been brought up in, I'm just not sure that they should somehow be exempt from protection, because some might argue that they could change their religion or become not religious. I think also science has proved a few things. Science has proved that race doesn't exist. And science has also proved that there's probably a religious gene in people. So query whether you can change that.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt at the end. I'm very conscious of the time. I know Rick's got his hand up. We might have space for one short question after Rick, but it would just, I guess it would depend on how lengthy it is. Rick?
Thanks. I'll try to keep it brief. Thanks for putting a name and a face to those victims of the gay bashings and the crimes in the 1980s. I think it's really important to do that. My question is essentially what has changed in relation to that. So back when I was an angry young activist, we sort of worked on a lot of these issues. But since then, and at the time there was a lot of police harassment and continued violence in beats in particular. But since then we've had Grindr, we've had high profile, high court judge, politicians from the LGBTI community, a lot more visibility of these issues. Are you in your practice still seeing those issues of violence in beats, violence amongst gay men in those sort of situations? And also about police, are police still harassing gay men who are meeting each other in public places?
Thanks, Rick. I don't think I can speak. I see a lot of violence against the LGBTI community in my practice, but I wouldn't put it as systemic or state-based. I think Grindr apps, dating apps have raised vulnerabilities for everyone in relation to how they date, who they meet online, and the misrepresentations that can occur in dating apps as to who someone might be. And I have had clients who have, I've been acting for them in a criminal capacity. I should have said also that my main gig is criminal law, in case you missed that. But I've had clients come to me who have effectively been in a hotel room, met someone on Grindr, that person has come in and given one of my clients drugs. They then become inebriated and have discovered a video of them online of them being effectively violently bashed in a bathroom while intoxicated. I've seen that quite a bit, but I won't put that down to straight on gay. I won't put that on police. I just think that it's a vulnerable situation. You mix online dating and sex with drugs and you've got problems.
Thanks for that.
All right, I'm sorry to put the damper on all the very interesting questions, but unfortunately we've come up to 7 o'clock. I wanted to thank Nicholas so much for such insightful commentary and so much for us to think about and issues to continue to explore, and hopefully people will watch the Legislative Council inquiry in great detail. So thank you, Nicholas, for your time, and thank you everyone else for your questions and your participation this evening.
Thanks a lot, Jane. Thanks, everyone.
Night, everyone.
Night, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, it was great.
Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you, guys.
Wow, so many thank yous. See if thank yous in the chat box, Nick.